I was sitting in my dorm room when my phone rang. Seeing Dad's name on the screen made me smile. He usually called on Sundays, and this was a Wednesday. "Hey, Dad." "Chloe, sweetie," his voice sounded different, strained. "I need to have a serious conversation with you. Can you come home?" My heart skipped a beat. Dad wasn't one for dramatics. "What's wrong?" "We should talk in person, please." I checked my calendar, midterms were coming up. "I can come in 2 weeks. Is that okay?" "Yes, that's fine," he paused. "I love you, Chloe." Those 2 weeks were the longest of my life. I could barely focus on my studies, my mind constantly wandering to what Dad might need to tell me. The train ride to my hometown felt endless. I watched familiar landscapes roll by, my stomach in knots. When I finally arrived home, my stepmother Margaret opened the door. Her face was tense, and she immediately wrapped me in a hug, something she rarely did. "He's in his office," she said quietly, leading me down the hallway. The moment I saw Dad, my blood ran cold. He sat behind his massive oak desk, but somehow he looked small, diminished. His clothes hung loose on his frame and his face was ashen. "Chloe," he smiled weakly. "Come here, sweetheart." I rushed to hug him, trying not to show how shocked I was by how fragile he felt in my arms. "Dad, what's going on?" He gestured for me to sit and took a deep breath. "The doctors found cancer, honey. It's advanced. They don't think I have much time left." The room started spinning. I felt Margaret's arms around me as I struggled to breathe. "I'm so sorry," Dad whispered. "I hope you can visit often. I want to spend as much time with you as possible." We spent the entire weekend together. Dad barely touched his food during meals, but he talked more than I'd ever heard him talk before. He told stories about my childhood, my first steps, my first words, the time I decided to paint the cat purple. And he talked about Mom. "Your mother was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen," he said, his eyes distant. "The day she walked into that coffee shop, I spilled my drink all over myself just staring at her." During these stories, Margaret would quietly slip out of the room, giving us space. Dad's voice would get softer when he talked about Mom, about how she fought her illness until the very end, how brave she was even when she knew she wouldn't see me grow up. I was 9 when Mom died, but listening to Dad's stories made her feel close again, like she was sitting right there with us. Even though my heart was breaking for Dad, those moments felt precious, like he was giving me back pieces of her I'd forgotten. After that first weekend, everything changed. I started calling Dad every day between classes, and I took the train home every weekend instead of once a month. Each time I called, his voice sounded a little weaker, but he always brightened up when I told him about my classes or campus life. At first, Margaret seemed supportive. But as the weeks went by, something shifted. The welcoming hug stopped. Instead of warm greetings, I got curt nods. During meals, she'd sit there pushing food around her plate, refusing to make eye contact. "How are your classes going, Chloe?" Dad would ask, trying to break the tension. "Good," I'd answer, watching Margaret's jaw clench. "I got an A on my psychology paper." "That's wonderful, sweetheart." Slam. Margaret would get up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and storm off to the kitchen. Dad started chemotherapy in October. The hospital stays became longer, more frequent. During those times, the house felt like a war zone. Margaret stopped acknowledging my presence altogether. The sound of slamming doors followed me everywhere. The kitchen, her bedroom, the bathroom, slam, slam, slam. One Friday evening, after spending the afternoon with Dad at the hospital, I came home starving. The house was dark and cold. No dinner smells, no pots on the stove. Nothing. I found Margaret in the living room, scrolling through her phone. "What's for dinner?" I asked. She looked up, her face hard. "I didn't make anything. I wasn't counting on having to feed you." The words felt like a slap. "What do you mean? I'm here every weekend now," Exactly, she put down her phone. You're here every weekend. If you want to eat, cook for yourself. I stared at her, stunned by her tone. What's going on, Margaret? Why are you acting like this? Nothing's going on, her voice dripped with sarcasm. I just think you're coming here a bit too often. My father has cancer, I said, my voice shaking. He's sick. Of course I'm coming to see him. She muttered something under her breath and turned back to her phone, dismissing me completely. I stood there for a moment, then went upstairs without dinner. As I lay in my bed, listening to another door slam somewhere in the house, I thought about telling Dad. But he had enough to worry about with his treatments. The last thing he needed was to know about this tension between his wife and daughter. After a month of intense chemotherapy, Dad was finally released from the hospital. His doctors seemed cautiously optimistic, saying his body was responding well to the treatment. When I got this news, I immediately booked my usual weekend train ticket home, eager to see him in better spirits. The autumn air was crisp as I walked up our driveway that Friday afternoon. Something felt different, there were more cars than usual parked outside. I recognized one of them instantly, Mark's sleek black Nissan that he never shut up about when we were teenagers. My stomach tightened. If Mark was here, that meant Jessica probably was too. I hadn't seen my step-siblings in over a year, and that was fine by me. Jessica, being a year older, always made it clear she considered herself superior. And Mark, 6 years my senior, treated me like I was too young to exist in his orbit. The front door was unlocked. As I stepped inside, I found Dad in his favorite armchair, looking tired but better than he had in weeks. His smile when he saw me made my heart warm. There's my girl, he said, reaching for a hug. How are you feeling, Dad? Before we could talk more, Margaret appeared with Jessica and Mark in tow. I greeted them and excused myself to take my bags upstairs. As I climbed the stairs, I could hear them all laughing about something in the kitchen. The sound made me feel like an outsider in my own home, a feeling I thought I'd left behind when they all moved out years ago. I reached my bedroom door and froze. The door was open, and inside was definitely not my room anymore. My vintage movie posters were gone, replaced by Jessica's pretentious art prints. My purple bedspread was nowhere to seen, instead, there was some fancy white duvet with about 50 decorative pillows. Jessica's clothes were hanging in my closet, her makeup scattered across my dresser. I stormed back downstairs, my hands shaking. Margaret, can I talk to you for a minute? Privately? She followed me into the living room, that artificial smile still plastered on her face. Why is Jessica in my room? I demanded, trying to keep my voice down. Oh, that, she waved her hand dismissively. Well, since they're moving back, it made sense to give Jessica the larger room. You're only here on weekends, after all. That's my room, I said through gritted teeth. It's always been my room. There are 2 perfectly good guest rooms upstairs. Do you really want to upset your father over something so trivial? She whispered, her smile never wavering. He's finally feeling better. Do you want him to have to deal with this drama? Over a bedroom? The words hit their mark perfectly. I looked over at Dad, who was chatting happily with Mark about something. He did look better, there was more color in his face than I'd seen in weeks. My shoulders slumped in defeat. Fine. Which guest room can I use? The small one at the end of the hall, Margaret said sweetly. Jessica's things are in the other one. I bit my tongue and headed upstairs to move my weekend bag to my new room, if you could even call it that. The room was tiny, with barely enough space for a twin bed and a small dresser. The walls were an awful beige color I'd always hated, and the window overlooked the neighbor's brick wall. The next morning, we all gathered for lunch. Dad sat at the head of the table, picking at his special diet food while the rest of us had Margaret's pot roast. The silence was deafening until I decided to address the elephant in the room. So, Jessica, I said, trying to keep my voice casual, how long are you planning to stay? Jessica looked up from her plate with that irritating smirk I remembered so well from our teenage years. Oh, I'm not just staying, I'm moving back permanently. Someone needs to be here to take care of Dad, after all. Since you're so busy with college and everything. I felt my face flush. I come home every weekend. Weekends aren't enough, Jessica interrupted. Dad needs constant care and attention. But don't worry, I'll handle it. I'm happy to make the sacrifice. Mark cleared his throat. Yeah, I'm staying too. Got some remote work lined up. Figure the family should stick together during tough times. I glanced at Margaret, who was watching the exchange with undisguised satisfaction. She looked like a cat who'd just cornered a mouse. My hands clenched under the table, and I opened my mouth to respond, but then I caught sight of Dad. He was smiling softly, obviously pleased to have everyone around him. The words died in my throat. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in my dorm room working on a paper when my phone rang. It was Aunt Sarah, Dad's sister. Chloe, honey, her voice was shaking. Your father, he's taken a turn for the worse. The doctors say, you should come home. I didn't even pack properly. I threw some clothes in a bag, ran to the administration office, and filed for emergency academic leave. The whole time, my mind was racing. Why hadn't Margaret called me? Why did it take my aunt to let me know? When I finally reached the house, I knocked repeatedly. I could hear movement inside, voices, the TV playing, but nobody came to the door. I knocked again, harder this time. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. Finally, the door opened. Margaret stood there in her silk robe, looking at me like I was a door-to-door salesperson interrupting her evening. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice cold. I pushed past her into the house. I took academic leave. I'm moving back home to be with Dad. Don't bother, Margaret said, following me into the foyer. He was taken to the hospital 2 days ago. He's on life support. You should go back to college. Focus on your studies. There's nothing you can do for him now. Actually, I said, squaring my shoulders, I have every right to be here. This is my house too. Margaret's thin lips curved into a smug smile. Don't worry, dear. It won't be for long. I didn't have time to decipher what she meant by that cryptic comment. I dropped my bags in the tiny guest room and rushed to the hospital. Dad's room was in the ICU. He lay motionless among a tangle of tubes and wires, machines beeping steadily around him. His face was so pale it almost matched the white hospital sheets. I touched his hand, it felt cold. Miss Matthews, a doctor appeared behind me. I'm Dr. Roberts. I've been overseeing your father's care. How is he? The doctor's face softened with sympathy. I need to be honest with you. Your father's cancer has spread aggressively. The chemotherapy, it's not working anymore. You should prepare yourself for the worst. I stayed until visiting hours ended, talking to Dad even though he couldn't respond. I told him about college, about my friends, about the A I got on my last paper, anything to fill the terrible silence broken only by the beeping machines. When I got back to the house, Margaret, Jessica, and Mark were in the living room watching TV. None of them looked up when I walked in. Jessica actually turned up the volume. I stood there for a moment, invisible as always, then headed upstairs. The next few days fell into a miserable pattern. I'd spend all day at the hospital, talking to Dad's unconscious form, then come home to a house full of people who looked through me like I was a ghost. They'd have conversations around me like I wasn't there, eat meals without setting a place for me, close doors in my face. One afternoon, I came home early because the doctors were running tests. As I walked in, I heard Margaret on the phone in the kitchen. Yes, I want a complete renovation, she was saying. New floors throughout, knock down that wall between the living room and dining room, completely redo the kitchen. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Are you seriously planning home renovations right now? I interrupted. While your husband is dying in the hospital? Margaret covered the phone's mouthpiece with her hand. Life goes on, Chloe. We can't all spend our time wallowing. This isn't even your house to renovate. She raised an eyebrow. Not yet, but it will be soon enough. I stood there, staring at her, as the full meaning of her words sank in. She thought she was going to inherit the house. She actually believed that when Dad died, everything would be hers. Without another word, I turned and went up to my room. Only when I'd closed the door did I allow myself to smile. She had no idea that this house had never been Dad's to leave to anyone. This had been Mom's house, passed down from her parents. And before she died, she'd made sure it would go to me. The deed was in my name, had been since I was 9 years old. Dad had only ever been living here, paying the taxes and maintaining the property as my guardian. Margaret had spent 11 years thinking she'd married into a beautiful home that would one day be hers. All her recent behavior, the hostility, moving her kids in, planning renovations, suddenly made perfect sense. She was already acting like she owned the place. I spent that final week at the hospital, watching Dad slip away. The doctors said he couldn't hear me anymore, but I kept talking anyway. He died on a Tuesday at 3:47 a.m. I was holding his hand when it happened. Margaret took over the funeral arrangements immediately, acting like the grieving widow in charge. She barely consulted me about anything, not the flowers, not the service, not even the obituary. The funeral was exactly what you'd expect from Margaret, showy and expensive. She'd chosen the biggest funeral home in town, ordered massive flower arrangements, hired a string quartet. She stood at the front, dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief while Jessica and Mark flanked her, all three of them performing grief like it was a stage play. After the last mourners had left and the flowers had been cleared away, Margaret cornered me in the foyer of our house, or what she thought was about to become her house. "Well," she said, her eyes completely dry now, "I think it's time for you to pack your things." Jessica and Mark stood behind her, arms crossed, looking like bouncers at a club. I kept my face neutral. "I think we should wait for the reading of the will." "The will?" Margaret's eye twitched. "That's just a formality." "But fine, if you insist on dragging this out." They made the next week hell. They'd slam doors when I walked by, have loud conversations about redecorating their house, leave passive-aggressive notes about my things taking up space. I stayed in my tiny room most of the time, counting down the days until the will reading. Finally, Mr. Patterson, Dad's lawyer, came to the house. We all gathered in the living room, Margaret, Jessica, and Mark on the sofa, me in Mom's old armchair by the window. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat and began reading. "To my wife, Margaret, and her daughter Jessica, I leave my collection of fine jewelry, including my late wife's diamond earrings." Margaret and Jessica exchanged satisfied smiles. "To Mark, I leave my new Mercedes latest series." Mark's face lit up. "To my beloved daughter Chloe, I leave the sum of $100,000. I saw Margaret's smirk widen. Mr. Patterson folded the paper. Margaret waited a beat, then asked with exaggerated innocence, "And the house? Who did my husband leave the house to?" "The house isn't mentioned in the will, Mrs. Matthews." Margaret's face reddened. "That's impossible, check again. The will must be invalid if it doesn't mention our primary asset." I couldn't hold back any longer. I cleared my throat. "Actually, the house isn't in the will, because it was never Dad's to give away. This was my mother's house. She left it to me in her will when I was 9. Dad was just living here as my guardian until I came of age." The silence that followed was deafening. 3 pairs of eyes stared at me in shock. Mr. Patterson gathered his papers awkwardly. "I should be going. My condolences again for your loss." He hurried out, leaving me alone with 3 people whose faces were shocked. Margaret gripped the arm of the sofa so hard her knuckles turned white. "I always thought," she whispered, "I always believed the house belonged to your father." I shrugged, feeling oddly calm. "You should have checked instead of assuming. The property records are public." The shock on her face was starting to give way to something uglier. Jessica and Mark were exchanging panicked looks, probably realizing their grand plans of living here forever were crumbling. "Now," I said, standing up, "I'm giving you 2 weeks to find new accommodations and move out. I'm being generous, legally, I could make you leave immediately, but I didn't want to cause a scene while Dad was sick." "We're not going anywhere," Margaret shrieked, suddenly finding her voice. "This is our home." "No, it's not, it's my home, my mother's home. You have 2 weeks to figure it out, or I'll have to involve the police." They stormed off to their rooms, shooting me venomous looks. I heard doors slamming throughout the house, followed by angry voices and the sound of things being thrown. I barely slept that night, half expecting them to try something. When I finally dozed off around dawn, it wasn't for long. A tremendous crashing sound jolted me awake. I ran downstairs to find Margaret in the living room, literally tearing the wallpaper off the walls with her bare hands. Strips of the pale blue paper lay in shreds on the floor. "What are you doing?" I shouted. "I picked this wallpaper," she screamed, ripping down another strip. "I bought it. I hung it myself. If you want me out, fine, but I'm taking what's mine. Stop it right now. I took care of this house for 11 years, she grabbed a vase from the mantel, Mom's favorite crystal vase, and I lunged forward just in time to catch it before she could smash it. "I cleaned it, I decorated it, I made it beautiful. You lived here rent-free for 11 years, I shot back. You never paid property taxes, never even had a job. Dad paid for everything." She responded by shoving the coffee table over, sending books and photos scattering across the floor. Then she started pulling books off the shelves, throwing them against the walls. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The police arrived within minutes, lights flashing. By then, Margaret had moved on to the dining room, where she was pulling down the curtains rod and all. Jessica and Mark had joined her, cheering her on from the doorway. 2 officers entered, taking in the scene of destruction. "Ma'am," one officer said to Margaret, "what you're doing constitutes criminal damage to property. If you don't stop immediately, we'll have no choice but to place you under arrest." After the police warning, Margaret finally stopped her rampage. She stood in the middle of the destroyed living room, chest heaving, surrounded by the wreckage of her tantrum. I gathered them all at the dining room table, the only piece of furniture still intact. "You're leaving now," I said, my voice steady. "Not in 2 weeks, today. You've shown exactly who you are, and I want you out of my house immediately." "You can't just," Jessica started. "I can, and I will, pack your things. Take what Dad left you in the will, the jewelry, the car, whatever else. But if you're not out of here by sunset, I'm calling the police again. And this time, they won't just give you a warning." They started swearing, hurling insults and threats. I pulled out my phone and started dialing 911 again. They got the message. The next few hours were filled with the sound of angry footsteps, doors slamming, and muttered curses. Margaret and Jessica stuffed their clothes into suitcases, Mark gathered his things, and they made multiple trips loading everything into their cars. I followed them around the house, making sure they only took what was rightfully theirs. Margaret tried to sneak out with some of Mom's old silver, but one look at my phone in my hand made her put it back. Mark had already moved his precious inherited Mercedes into the driveway. Jessica and Margaret loaded up their jewelry boxes, casting me venomous looks the whole time. "You'll regret this," Margaret hissed as she walked past me toward the door. "You're just like your mother, selfish and entitled." I smiled. "Thank you. That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me." The moment their cars disappeared down the street, I called a locksmith. He arrived within the hour and changed every lock in the house. I watched him work, making a mental list of everything that needed to be repaired thanks to Margaret's outburst. The living room was a disaster zone. Shredded wallpaper, broken furniture, scattered books and knickknacks. The dining room curtains lay in a heap on the floor, the rod bent beyond repair. It would take weeks to fix everything. I called Aunt Sarah, my favorite relative, and the only one who'd seen through Margaret from the beginning. The vultures are gone, I told her when she answered. Thank God. How bad is the damage? Pretty bad. I need to hire contractors to fix everything, but I have to go back to college. Would you? Say no more, honey. I'll oversee the repairs. And once it's fixed up, I'm going to rent it out while I finish school. A proper lease, with proper tenants. No more freeloaders. After hanging up with Aunt Sarah, I walked through the house one last time. Despite the destruction, it felt lighter somehow, like a shadow had been lifted. I touched the walls, remembering how Mom had loved this place, how she'd wanted to make sure it would always be mine. The next morning, I headed back to college, leaving Aunt Sarah with my keys and insurance information. As the train pulled away from the station, I felt something I hadn't felt since before Dad got sick: hope. The house would be repaired, and then it would help fund my education through rental income. Most importantly, it would stay in the family, just like Mom wanted. Her legacy, preserved. I never saw Margaret or her children again. Sometimes I wonder if they ever think about how differently things might have turned out if they'd just been kind, if they'd treated me like family instead of an inconvenience. But mostly, I don't think about them at all.